have a better opportunity. I sold everything we had within 2 days, made arrangements, and then on the day I decided to leave, I had just enough clothes for those 9 kids to put on and load it in the trunk of a car.
My mind is upset. I feel so
During the
bad.
1950s, 1.5 million Appalachians had moved north.
I once have had.
They became part of one of the largest population shifts in American history.
Things are bound coming my way.
Jobless coal miners were joined by more than 1 million black workers fleeing poverty and racism in the Deep South.
The things that you wanted to do, you couldn't do. There was jobs, domestic jobs. That was basically what you could do. You could only work in lower paying jobs. You couldn't move up because of segregation.
My uncles, the reason they left was not because they wanted to really leave Mississippi, but because there wasn't a whole lot of future in agriculture, in their staying down there if they did not own the land. And they did not own the land. We did like many families, came north looking for work, looking for the opportunity. I mean, it was, to borrow that oft-used phrase, it was the promised land to go north.
I'm a blues singer. I do comedy and sing the blues. I'm a truck driver, I'm a janitor, I'm a bartender. Figure I'd get a better chance.
You think you can do one of those things up here more than you could in New Orleans?
I'd be more appreciated with one up here than I was in New Orleans. 7 cents an hour can't feed a family.
7 cents an hour?
70 cents.
70 cents an hour. How much money did you arrive with?
7 cents.
As a little girl, I had seen people come home on vacation from Chicago, and they had on pretty clothes, and they drove shiny cars, and they had money. And I thought, gee, I want to go there and enjoy some of that.
Chicago was this land of opportunity where if you had a strong back and a willingness to work, you could make it. There were jobs, jobs, and jobs. And that was the key, that you could get work. And if you could get work, you could make it.
Chicago was the nation's second largest city. During the 1950s, more than 200,000 Southerners had moved there to start a new life.
When we drove in on the lakefront, I remember thinking, wow, this is like, it's like a little twinkly jewel, you know, with all these lights that look like diamonds or something strung up.
When I got here, it was night. And oh, the bright lights, and they drove me downtown to see all the big stores and the tall buildings, which I had never seen before. Oh, I just knew I was going places then.
In the 10 years after World War II, Chicago had prospered more than any city in America. It was the nation's fastest growing industrial area, producing more steel than Pittsburgh or Great Britain.
When my mother and father first came to Chicago, my daddy said he got a job loading boxcars at the railroad at a Christmas rush, and then they both went into factories.
They had the stockyards, they had the steel mills, they had Continental Can, and so there were a lot of job opportunities.
Although work was plentiful in Chicago, blacks were often paid lower wages than whites and barred entry from many good jobs. There were few black bus drivers and few black sales clerks in downtown department stores. Blacks were systematically excluded from many of the construction unions.
The white girls would get promotions on the job, and you wouldn't. And that made you feel, you know, that, hey, what am I doing wrong? That we're both doing the same job, and they can get a promotion, and you couldn't. So that's when I found out that the segregation was here just like it was in the South.
Segregation created severe overcrowding for Chicago's black residents.
We had a 4-room apartment, And the landlord decided before we moved in to rent one of the rooms out in the middle of our apartment. So in our apartment, we had a family living in one room who had 5 children.
Even in the South, you had maybe a shack, but it was your own shack, and you didn't share it with anybody else. And that made an awful lot of difference.
On Chicago's north side, white migrants from Appalachia were concentrated in their own ghetto.
My family moved into Uptown because it was a neighborhood that accepted transients, migrants. We were called in-migrants.
It was called Hillbilly Heaven after we found out about it, because everybody was from West Virginia, Kentucky, Alabama, Tennessee. It was just a bunch of hillbillies that got around there.
As the Appalachian migrants crowded into Chicago, animosity towards the newcomers grew. Local press reports described them as being at the bottom of the heap, socially, morally, and mentally.
They think they can come to a large city and just more or less get rich overnight. They have no initiative for hard work.
Well, some of the problems we have is tenants won't cooperate with us. They throw trash around. They drink out on the street and throw beer bottles on my lawn. They throw beer bottles and whiskey bottles in my hallways. And they just don't seem to be concerned about other people's property.
If people, you know, if we were looking for an apartment and people found out, you know, there were 2 children, it's like, well, you know, they're those hillbillies and they're going to trash up the place. So I got a sense that we weren't as good as other people, or that other people didn't feel that we were as good. There's this talk, you know, about if you work really hard, you know, in America, if you come to the city, you can have anything you want, you know, you can get stuff, you can buy a house or whatever. And I saw all kinds of people for whom that was not happening. People who worked hard, people who tried hard, people who gave years of their lives, but who wound up with nothing.
The hopeful poor were still flocking to Chicago. But in the mid-1950s, a steady erosion of jobs for unskilled workers had begun.
The stockyards had begun to shut down. The steel mills had begun to slow down. And many of the other places that supported those industries had begun to slack off. And so for the newcomers, because they were the last hired, were the first to be fired. So things began to look very, very gloomy and shaky for that last coming group.
The people then who were coming up could not get the same kind of employment that their parents had. And so without an education, like they could not do with the same kind of education what their parents could do. And so they became sort of stuck and trapped in this place in a way that their parents weren't, in a way that the preceding generation had not been.
Chicago lost more than 100,000 manufacturing jobs in a single decade. By 1963, more than 20% of families on the city's west side lived below the poverty line. Many relied on welfare and government food handouts.
I began to see the breakdown and the disillusion of family life among the less fortunate black folk, based on economics, based on the fact there were no jobs, there was no income. And the embarrassment of having to ask someone for something. Many of these people had left the South because they were tired of being beggars. They were tired of being without. They knew what poverty was. They were not poverty-stricken at this point, and the difference between being poor and poverty-stricken is substantial. If one becomes poverty-stricken, that is an attitude, it's a frame of mind. But I began to see that begin to creep in, that here were people already beginning to believe there was no hope, there were no dreams that could be realized.
Changes in Chicago were being repeated across the country. In New York, Newark, Cleveland, and Philadelphia, manufacturing jobs were decreasing, and welfare rolls were growing. In 1963, more than half of all poor Americans lived in cities.
There was this expansion of the social burden of poverty. It became very clear that the cities and local and state government would not be able to cope effectively with the cost of these social burdens, that there had to be a federal initiative, there had to be some initiative somewhere, and there were no initiatives of any significance to deal with these emerging problems.
In all these discussions, disarmament loomed so large. When we talked to the Canadians the other day,
President Kennedy had not been focusing on the economic trouble developing in America's cities. During his first 2 years in office, Kennedy's attention had been on confrontations with communism in Berlin, Cuba, and Vietnam, where he had sent his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. But America was about to rediscover the poor.
Good evening. The Cold War, Castro, de Gaulle have all been displaced as America's #1 problem. Tonight, news and comment on the nation's economy and the other America.
The Other America, by the socialist writer Michael Harrington, presented a stark portrait of life among America's poor. It challenged assumptions that poverty was disappearing with economic growth.
Somehow just the details that he brought to life in that book of the way people lived in poverty, the kind of things I'd never seen before, and the numbers of people that were living in poverty just struck me as something I couldn't imagine that were so, that this other America was as large as it was. And I can still remember feeling, I can picture, it's one of those moments I can picture sitting under a tree, reading it, and feeling like somehow something's got to be done about this.
In Washington, The Other America impressed Kennedy.
He demanded of his advisors that they tell him, well, who are these many millions of Americans who are earning $1,000 a year, $2,000 a year, not earning anything at all? Who are they? Why are they poor? What has to be done to get them out of poverty? And so he told his advisors to go back and I'll bring him more information.